Last episode, we talked about rebuilding, about laying the first brick, about faith as the decision to trust before you have proof. But there's a question underneath all of that we haven't asked yet. Who exactly are you rebuilding for? Most people who grew up around religion can answer questions about God faster than they can describe their own reflection. They know the rules. They know the rituals. They know what to say in a room full of other believers. But ask them what God actually sounds like in a quiet room, alone with no audience, and the answer gets a lot less certain. That's not a failure of faith. It's a symptom of something very common, knowing about God without knowing God, inheriting a religion instead of building a relationship. And here's why this matters, for everything we talked about last episode. You can lay every brick correctly, you can rebuild the foundation, the walls, the roof. But if you're building this new life for a version of God you were handed by someone else, a distant judge, a disappointed parent in the sky, a set of rules to perform, you'll finish construction on a house nobody actually lives in. So today, before we go any further in this rebuild, we stop and ask the harder question, not do you believe in God? Almost everyone says yes to that. The real question is, have you ever actually met him? This isn't about doubting your faith or tearing down what you already have. If anything, it's the opposite. It's about making sure the thing you've spent your whole life defending is actually yours, not a version you memorized to keep the peace in your family, not a P, the religion you inherited. Most people's first experience with God wasn't a decision. It was an inheritance. You were born into a family, a culture, a country that already had an answer to who God was, long before you were old enough to ask the question yourself. Maybe that meant a building you visited on a specific day of the week. Maybe it meant a set of rules about what made you good or bad in God's eyes. Maybe it meant watching the adults around you perform certainty they didn't actually feel. None of that is necessarily wrong. Inheritance can be a starting point. The problem is when it's never anything more than that. When 30 years later, you're still running someone else's relationship with God on someone else's terms and calling it your own faith. Think about the difference between hearing love described your whole life and actually falling in love yourself. No amount of second-hand description prepares you for the real thing. Now you can memorize every poem about it and still be completely unprepared for what it actually feels like when it happens to you. Faith works the same way. You can memorize every verse, attend every service, follow every rule, and still have never once experienced the thing all of that was supposed to point to. An inherited religion can fill a building, only a personal relationship can fill the empty room inside you that religion alone was never designed to reach. This is why so many people quietly walk away from faith the moment life gets hard enough to test it, not because the faith itself failed them, but because it was never load-bearing in the first place. It was decoration, a set of answers that worked fine in easy seasons and collapsed the first time real weight was applied. You can't lean your whole life on something you never actually built yourself. It's worth being honest about how this usually happens. Nobody sits down one day and decides to inherit their faith passively. It happens by default, by never questioning, by assuming belief would eventually arrive on its own if you just kept showing up. But belief rarely arrives that way. It's built the same way everything else worth having is built, on purpose, brick by brick, through actual engagement instead of passive attendance, believing in God versus knowing Him. Here's a distinction that changes everything. Once you actually see it, believing God exists and knowing God are not the same thing. You can believe in gravity without ever once thinking about it. You cannot know a person that way. Believing is intellectual. It's a fact you accept, filed away with the rest of what you consider true. Knowing requires something else entirely. Time, honesty, vulnerability, the willingness to be disappointed and to keep showing up. Anyway, most people's faith stays at the believing stage forever because knowing is uncomfortable. Knowing means bringing your actual questions instead of your rehearsed ones. It means admitting the doubt you're not supposed to have in front of other believers. It means sitting in silence long enough for something real to happen, instead of filling every quiet moment with a memorized prayer. There's a story of a prophet who expected to find God in an earthquake, in a fire, in a windstorm, and in something loud enough to match the size of who he believed God to be. Instead, God was in a whisper so quiet, he almost missed it entirely. Most people are still out here waiting for the earthquake. They walk right past the whisper because nobody ever told them that's usually where he actually shows up. If your entire relationship with God has been built on other people's loud encounters, their testimonies, their sermons, their certainty, it might be time to go looking for your own whisper. It's quieter than you expect and far more personal than anything you've been told about secondhand. There's also a strange kind of courage this requires, and the courage to admit that everything you were told about how God shows up might not match your actual experience, and that this doesn't make you a worse believer. It might make you a more honest one. Most spiritual breakthroughs don't happen in the moment someone finally believes hard enough. They happen in the moment someone finally stops performing belief and starts actually paying attention. The distance fear creates, one of the biggest reasons people never get close to God, is a version of him they were taught to fear instead of trust. A God who is mostly disappointed, mostly keeping score, mostly waiting for you to mess up. If that's the God you were introduced to, of course you kept your distance. Nobody runs towards someone they're afraid of. You don't bring your real self, your anger, your doubt, your mess, to someone you believe is standing there with a clipboard, tallying every mistake. So instead, people perform. They show up polished, say the right words, and keep the real conversation for somewhere safer. A therapist, a friend, a journal nobody else reads. God gets the version of you built for public appearances. Everyone else gets whatever's left. But that fear-based distance isn't loyalty to God. It's a wall you built, brick by brick, usually without realizing it, out of self-protection. And walls don't just keep the disappointment, it's honesty. Bringing exactly what you are, unfinished, frustrated, doubting, instead of the edited version you think earns approval. A relationship built on performance was never going to survive contact with the real you anyway. Consider how much energy performance actually costs. Keeping two versions of yourself running at once, the one you show God and the one you actually are, is exhausting in a way most people never name out loud. It's the same exhaustion as maintaining any relationship built on image instead of honesty. The relief isn't in becoming a better performer. It's in finally putting the performance down. There's a particular kind of tiredness that comes from decades of managing an image in front of God, and most people never connect the two. They feel spiritually drained without realizing the exhaustion isn't from faith itself. It's from the constant maintenance of a version of themselves that was never real to begin with. Put the performance down even once, and notice how much lighter honesty feels by comparison. What silence really means. At some point in this process, almost everyone hits the same wall. Silence. You pray and it feels like the ceiling. You ask a real question honestly for the first time, and nothing comes back. No feeling, no answer, just quiet. Most people interpret that silence as rejection, or worse, as proof there's nothing there to find. But silence and absence are not the same thing. A friend sitting beside you in a hospital waiting room, saying nothing isn't absent. Sometimes presence doesn't announce itself. It just stays. Consider how differently silence lands depending on who you trust it belongs to. Silence from someone who has never shown up for you feels like abandonment. Silence from someone who has proven over years that they're not going anywhere feels like safety. Like you don't need constant noise to know the relationship is real. This is usually the exact point where people give up on ever knowing God for themselves, right at the threshold, mistaking the quiet for an empty room. But the quiet is often where the relationship actually deepens if you're willing to stay in it a little longer than feels comfortable, instead of walking out the moment it stops being loud. Think about any meaningful relationship in your life. The ones that lasted weren't built entirely on constant talking. Some of the deepest trust was built in comfortable silence, sitting in the same room, doing nothing and still feeling completely at peace with the other person. Faith can hold that same kind of silence if you let it, instead of treating every quiet moment as proof something is wrong. The God who meets you in the rubble. Go back to the rebuilding metaphor from last episode. Most people wait to approach God until the reconstruction is finished, until they've cleaned up, until they look presentable, until the walls are back up and the mess is out of view. But that's backwards. The God worth actually knowing isn't waiting at the finish line, applauding the polished result. He's the one who shows up in the rubble before a single brick is laid, not impressed by your progress, present in your wreckage. There's a reason. The most honest moments people describe with God happened at their lowest, not their most put together. Nobody meets God for real from a place of having it all figured out. The performance version of you doesn't need Him. It's the person standing in the ruins, out of options, who finally stops managing the encounter and just shows up as they actually are. If you're in your own rubble right now, mid-rebuild, exhausted, unsure if any of this is working, that's not the wrong time to look for God. Statistically, historically, personally, it's usually the exact moment He's easiest to find. Not because He wasn't there before, because that's usually the first time you stopped performing long enough to notice. This is honestly good news disguised as discomfort. It means you don't need to wait for a better version of yourself to start this relationship. You don't need 6 more months of discipline, or a cleaner track record, or fewer doubts. The invitation was never conditional on having it together. It was always open, even in the middle of the mess, maybe especially there. This changes how you can approach every future setback in your rebuild. Instead of retreating from God when things fall apart, instead of waiting for the next attempt at reconstruction before reaching out again, you can bring the collapse itself into the relationship, not after you've cleaned it up, while it's still happening. That single shift alone changes what this relationship is capable of holding. Prayer without performance. If your prayer life has ever felt like reciting lines, you're not alone and you're not doing it wrong. You were probably just taught the performance before you were ever taught the relationship. Formal words, familiar structure, the same requests in the same order most nights. There's nothing wrong with structure, but structure was never meant to replace honesty. Imagine talking to your closest friend only in memorized formal sentences. It would feel hollow within a week. They'd notice something was missing. So would you. Real prayer sounds a lot more like the conversation you'd have with someone who already knows everything about you and loves you anyway. Frustrated prayers, confused prayers. Prayers that are really just, I don't understand this and I'm tired. Those aren't lesser prayers. They're often the first honest ones a person has prayed in years. Try this instead of the version you were taught to perform. Say exactly what's true right now, without editing it into something that sounds more spiritual. The unpolished version is usually the one that actually starts the relationship, because it's the first version that isn't for an audience. You might worry this sounds disrespectful, like showing up unpolished is somehow careless. It isn't. Bringing your actual self to someone isn't disrespect, it's trust. You only edit yourself in front of people you don't fully trust yet. The moment you stop editing is usually the moment you've finally started believing this. Relationship can survive the truth about you. The relationship nobody can perform for you. Here's something worth sitting with. You can be surrounded by people with strong, obvious faith, a parent, a pastor, a best friend, and still not have any faith of your own. Proximity to someone else's. Relationship with God was never a substitute for building your own. This shows up constantly. People who grew up in deeply faithful homes, who could recite every value they were taught, who still feel completely disconnected the moment they're on their own, because the faith they were living inside was never actually theirs. It belonged to the person who modeled it. They were standing in someone else's house of faith, mistaking the walls for their own. Nobody can have this relationship on your behalf. Not your parents' faith, not your partner's certainty, not the version you perform in front of people who assume you have it figured out. At some point you have to build your own foundation, not because everyone else's was wrong, but because a borrowed foundation cracks the moment life applies real pressure to it. This is uncomfortable to admit, especially if you've spent years looking like someone with strong faith. But Admitting you've been running on borrowed belief isn't a step backward. It's the first honest step towards something that will actually hold your weight when it matters most. The people who modeled faith for you likely weren't trying to hand you a substitute. Most of them were doing exactly what you might do for someone else one day, showing you what was possible, hoping you'd eventually go build your own version of it. Their faith was never meant to be your finish line. It was meant to be your starting point. You may even come to a place eventually where you can thank them for the starting point, even after you've built something entirely your own from it. The way you'd thank someone who taught you to ride a bike long after you've ridden thousands of miles they never saw. Their faith got you to the door. What happens past that door was always going to require you to walk through it yourself. Rebuilding your foundation on him. Bring this back to the construction site. Everything we talked about in episode 1, the foundation, the patience, the bricks nobody claps for, all of it eventually rests on something. The question is what? If the foundation is your own willpower, it will hold for a while and then crack the first time your willpower runs out. First, and it always eventually does. If the foundation is other people's approval, it will hold only as long as they keep approving. Both are foundations that were never designed to bear this kind of weight. A foundation built on an actual, personal relationship with God carries weight differently. Not because life gets easier, but because you're no longer building alone and no longer building for an audience that might walk away. The relationship itself becomes load-bearing. You don't need decades of theology to start this. You don't need to have it figured out. You need one honest conversation today with no performance in it. The kind you'd have with someone you actually wanted to know, not someone you were trying to impress. That conversation is the first brick of a foundation strong enough to hold everything else you're about to build. So close this episode the same way we opened it. Not with another rule, not with another performance, but with one honest sentence said out loud or in silence. To the God you've maybe only known secondhand until now, it doesn't need to be eloquent. It just needs to be true. That's how every real relationship in your life started. This one isn't any different. Whatever that sentence ends up being for you, a confession, a question, a request, even an accusation you've been holding on to for years, and say it. The bricks of every relationship worth having were always going to be honest ones. This foundation is no different than any other you'll lay in this rebuild. It starts the same way. One true thing, spoken instead of performed. If this episode moved something in you, subscribe. Next week, we keep building on exactly this foundation. I want to hear from you. Have you ever actually met God for yourself? Or has it mostly been inherited? Write it in the comments. Honestly, no performance needed here either. Never forget, you're stronger than you think. Before you go, here's what's coming next. Once you've met the God you're building for, there's still someone else you haven't fully met yet. The version of you that's been waiting this whole time, underneath everything you built to survive. Next episode, we go find them. I'll see you in the next chapter.